any of his promises. This vision with the ladder, you would think, what could be a bigger confidence booster? You know, we often correctly we point out that how people need so much encouragement. We need so much encouragement, and it's so important to give that encouragement and to try to ask for that encouragement when we need it. You think, okay, but look at Yaakov. I mean, he was the greatest, one of the greatest human beings who ever lived. It says his throne, his image was greater than Hashem's throne, and Hashem gave it. I mean, what could be more encouraging than Hashem appearing to you in a dream with a ladder, going up to heaven, and angels on the ladder, and then Hashem says, "I'm with you every step of the way. I've got your back, and I won't abandon you from the time you leave as you embark on your life's this journey of a lifetime. You'll come back with 4 wives, 11. He doesn't say exactly, but Yaakov knew that he was going to be father of a great nation. He comes up with 4 wives, 11 children, a huge household, lots of wealth, and Hashem says, "And I'm not going to let you go until I've returned you to your place." Okay, if that's not good enough, so then so the answer is that as the Torah teaches us that that's part of being great. We talk about Yirah Shamayim, fear of Hashem. We talk about that as an ideal to strive for us, and Hashem treasures fear of heaven. It's not a bad thing. The thing with fear is that it can be a bad thing. Sometimes, often, it has effects it can sometimes be unpleasant, and it can sometimes even be damaging. And the Yetzer Hara, of course, tries to corrupt everything. Will certainly try to make it so, because an emotion like fear, which is prone to leading us to dark places, Yetzer Hara will certainly try to use it to steer us into dark places. But the emotion of fear in and of itself is not a bad thing, and on the contrary, wise people use fear effectively to guide them in their behavior and to reach higher and higher levels. So here we find Yaakov, he's certainly not lacking in faith, and he certainly doesn't lack in appreciation for everything Hashem has given him. Instead of saying, okay, so if Hashem has given me all these promises and I've seen so much success, I should have a bit of self-confidence. Instead he says, I'm afraid, what more can I do? And that's really the key. Right? The key is that he springs into action. First, he makes a plan. Right? The first thing is almost the most practical. There might be a war, okay? I'll split everyone into 2 camps. He doesn't shy away from it. He doesn't panic. He doesn't say, what should I do? But he knows exactly what to do. He doesn't need any strategists or any cabinet ministers. He got it covered. He divides people into 2 camps, gives everybody their marching orders. That's number 1. Number 2, he prays to Hashem. Right? You almost think like it has to be 2 different people, no? I mean, one person, the one person's job is to pray and do the religious thing, and somebody else has to be not true. But Yaakov has it all. First, he strategizes and he prays, and then third of all, he says, "Let's not forget diplomacy." And then he sends Esav an elaborate gift. He goes to the politician, the diplomat, the psychologist, the negotiator, whatever you want to call him. He does all those things. All of those things are motivated by Yaakov's fear. So the point is that we shouldn't look, and we don't want to be in a state where we feel misplaced confidence. What is Yaakov saying? He says, I know about Hashem's promises. Hashem is good for his word, but maybe I'm not. Right? Maybe I'm not measuring up. Right. And if we understand that, it also helps. Part of where we start, because we're inherently not so self-confident, certainly not like Yaakov Avinu. So if Hashem gives us a promise, we feel like if I can't be confident with that, then what could I be confident in? But when we realize that it's the state of human beings, it's even Yaakov Avinu, even Moshe Rabbeinu, nobody should feel confident. So then we don't have to be better than them. It's not a sign of weakness or how bad could Yaakov have been. What did he do already? There's nothing. It's just that we have to realize that because we start off with entitlement of 0, Hashem creates us from nothing, where we don't really have any claim on anything, and so everything that Hashem gives to us is a bonus, because we can't really give anything back, so we're always in debt. And all of our mitzvahs don't really serve to repay Hashem. Not that Hashem needs or wants repayment. We certainly couldn't give it to him even if he did want it. So we shouldn't fool ourselves. That's really what it's about. And again, because the sooner we understand this is innate to human condition, less uncomfortable we feel. If someone comes over and says, well, you are so bad, you are so unworthy that you can never repay Hashem. I think we'd all get defensive. But we know that every human being is unworthy, and no human being can, so there's nothing to be defensive about. It's just the nature of human existence. That's why it says Moshe Rabbeinu prayed to Hashem as Chanan. He prayed to Hashem 500 and something times to be allowed to enter the land of Eretz Yisrael. And the Hashem said, stop, it's not going to happen. Stop asking. And Rashi says, as Chanan, like the word chinam, you'll hear in Israel today, it means free. Moshe saying, I asked for a freebie. I asked Hashem for a favor. And Rashi says that righteous people, no matter how worthy they are, they never ask out of a sense of being deserved, out of a favor. Who would have been more entitled than Moshe Rabbeinu to ask for a favor? As a matter of fact, you look at some of the midrashim, he does seem to, you have to learn through those midrashim and interpret them, but he does make certain observations to Hashem. And, it's about 40 years that he says, I ran like a horse in front of people, their leader and their guide. And here I just expire in the desert. I don't even get to cross over the yard. So he could have, again, you have to read that midrash and understand what he was saying. But just from what the rabbis tell us of what's in the Torah, is he really did not ask out of a sense of entitlement. But certainly, if anyone would have been entitled to ask, it was Moshe, but he didn't do that. That's not the way righteous people behave. The Chovos HaLevavos says, he talks about our orientation, our attitude in serving Hashem. He discusses this issue that we have. We feel it's hard for us to serve Hashem selflessly because at the very least we hope that by doing mitzvahs we'll get more good stuff. We're looking for ways to earn more reward. To really serve Hashem in the ultimately pure way would be to say, Hashem has given me so much, and I have zero ability to repay him, and anything that I do is infinitely small, and therefore I have to just do whatever I can. That's the real way to serve Hashem. It's hard for us as human beings to reach that attitude. But he quotes this statement of Yaakov Katonti, I become small. He goes through, he says, four levels of human. He says basically every human being is indebted to Hashem for being alive, and then a particular nation might be indebted to Hashem for particular favors and miracles and acts of kindness he did for them. That's like the Jewish people. There might be groups within the Jewish people who have special, he said, like the Kohanim, for example. And then there might be individuals, he's a great leader, as Torah scholars, prophets, who has a specific role. And he says each level requires a new level of service of Hashem. It's an interesting way of thinking about it, right? When we think about why we do the mitzvahs, we're the chosen people, we're covenant, it's because Hashem did more favors for us. We're just more obligated. If I'm an Italian, then I have to appreciate all the things in my culture, my country and my heritage and just being alive like a human being. But I'm if I'm a Jew, then I have to think about our history. Every time we have the Seder, I mean, it's kind of obvious but I think it's one of those things like the Messiah says. It's so obvious and so much a part of our lingo. When we say it rolls off our tongue, we don't stop to think. Being Jewish means being more grateful to Hashem because Hashem has given us things that He hasn't given anyone else, and therefore we have to serve Him. So the difference between 7 mitzvahs that are universal and the 613 mitzvahs upon a Jew is because we owe Hashem more. And then that doesn't end there. If you're a Kohen, you've been given extra. He said at each level, the person fulfills that higher bar that's set for them, they'll get even more favors. Kind of like Hashem says, Moshe told the Jews at Har Sinai, if you keep the Torah, you'll be treasured among all other nations. Right? Your specialness will be off the charts. Hashem will cherish you and give you all kinds of amazing. But if you don't, he says, then it's so much worse. That's why the Jews, we talk about anti-Semitism. Right? That's the short answer is we suffer more because we received more. We have a greater obligation and higher stakes, better reward if we do the right thing, and more blame if we do the wrong thing. Kohen and king, he quotes a pasuk that a king, the wicked king suffers more than anyone else in the next world because he owes more. More is expected of him. If you look historically, some of the worst villains were the kings. Some of the best heroes were the kings. So he says that, and that is what. And he says, we use a simple analogy. He says a person has to give maaser, right? A farmer in Israel, it's 10% of the produce. So if I have a farmer that produced 100 bushels of wheat, he owes 10 of them. If he produced 1,000 bushels of wheat, he owed 100. Right? So imagine you have two farmers. One produced 100 bushels and gave 9.5. The other one produced 10 bushels and gave 1. So the one that produced 10 and gave 1 gets rewarded, and the one that produced 100 and gave 9.5 gets punished. Imagine these two farmers bringing their master to the lady, and one says, "Look, I have boxes, crates, truckloads, 9.5 truckloads." And the other one says, "I have one little sack," and this one gets rewarded, and that one gets punished. He says, "Do I have to look at it?" He says, "That is why the great people in the olden days would be worried when Hashem gave them a favor for two reasons. And first of all, because maybe they're not measuring up. Now this place has a higher obligation, and maybe they're not measuring up. Second of all, he says they don't want it to be a reward for them until they won't be one in the next world." I remember someone said, I wasn't there, but they brought the Rosh Hashiva, I think it was a silver menorah, some kind of gift towards the end of his life. It's pretty late in the game. But he was still okay. He was still it wasn't his final illness yet. So I think I don't even know what the occasion was. I don't know if it was reciprocated by anything specific or just a group of students decided to chip in and give him this gift. So they showed it to him. It was in his apartment, and he kind of boiled. He was very disturbed. I can't take this. Then I think they convinced him that it was a gift. He said, "Now I have so much more of an obligation to, at the end of a whole life, if you think about I'm getting into a whole biography now, but how much over the years, how many people, and how much, of himself that he had given, and the silver menorah is the kind of the drop in the bucket at the end of a whole career, and it's just really an expression of thank you from a few of the thousands of people that he interacted with, but he felt like it was an uncomfortable feeling of further indebtedness. And that's how we have to feel towards Hashem. So he quotes this thing with Yaakov. Yaakov says, I become small, meaning, in other words, what Yaakov essentially is saying is that I know who I am and what I do, and if you hadn't done all these wonderful things for me, I would have a certain level of comfort. But when I think about how much Hashem has given, maybe, I'm the guy who's still giving 1% or 9.5, and I should be giving 10. So that's and maybe my behavior was acceptable in the past. Maybe it's not acceptable. Maybe it hasn't grown commensurate with the kindness that Hashem has given me. And the point is that it's not, the Torah is the ultimate recipe for a healthy human being, a healthy society, a healthy world, and that's the fact. So, human beings are always struggling to find that healthy balance. It's impossible. First of all, it's like a needle in a haystack, right? Trying to hit the exact recipe for human perfection. But by definition, Hashem gave us the Torah to guide us to perfection. We're not going to figure it out without the Torah. The Torah tells us. So there have been points in human history or societies or religions where it's focused on guilt and blame, and there have been societies or cultures which focused on self-esteem and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What the Torah gives us all these things within a proper framework, and that's why we read these stories. At any point in our existence, no matter who we are in the human race and what time we live in, what country, we're going to look at some of the stories in the Torah and say, well, that doesn't sound right. By definition, because the Torah is always here to guide us to a deeper place. Right? So the Torah is telling us that Yaakov's behavior was the ultimate healthy reaction to a time of crisis. There was fear. He was, quote unquote, insecure, but Yaakov was the most self-confident and the healthiest person alive. Right? Yaakov did not in any way lose his courage. He did not in any way engage in unhealthy self-blame. He simply said, I recognize the reality that Hashem has given me more than I deserve because I can't, as a human being, I can't possibly deserve what Hashem has given me. I recognize that as a human being, I'm prone to error. And I recognize that there's no guarantee that I've done everything Hashem has expected of me. And therefore, it's quite possible that due to Hashem's kindness, I am now deficient and lacking in Hashem's balance. Therefore, I have to pray to Hashem. I have to prepare for the worst, and I have to hope for the best. That is a healthy recipe for a human being. So the Rosh used to quote a medrash about this week's parsha. It says the following: it says at a certain point in history were worthy of destruction. They should have been wiped out. What point in history was that? It was just for a story for him. And why were they worthy of destruction? So we know that there was a man named Haman, and he created a plan to wipe out the Jews, commit genocide. Genocide used to mean wiping out the Jews. Now it means Jews practicing self-defense, but used to be genocide and wiping out the Jews. So Haman tried to practice genocide, and but okay. So why did that happen? So we know there's a few famous. There are probably others, but they went to the party of Achashverosh. But that's not why the Jews were worthy of destruction. That was why the Jews were worthy of getting scared. And that was why Haman was given the power to scare the Jews. But that's not what was going on behind the scenes. Why were the Jews actually in danger? No. But at some point, it became very dangerous. Why? It says because when the Jews reacted to Haman's decree, as the Megillah describes, with the national sense of mourning and despair, at that point Hashem said to them, they quote, I forgot which pasuk it is, but it says, what happened to your religion? Doesn't your religion tell you that Hashem promises the Jewish people will be eternal? What is that? At that point, the destruction could have become a reality because this loss of hope and faith in Hashem's promises. But Medrash says, obviously that didn't happen. Why not? Because the Jews were excused on account of the fact that they were following the footsteps of Yaakov, their forefather, who, in the sixth parsha, Yaakov also received promises from Hashem, and Yaakov was also afraid of his brother Esau. So the Rosh said, well, how does that make sense? The Jews were blamed for getting scared of Haman, and it was considered so egregious that it could have been destroyed. They were not destroyed because Hashem recognized that Hashem excused them on the grounds that they were trying to emulate Yaakov Avinu, who also, despite had received promises from Hashem, and yet nevertheless felt fear when he was confronted with Esau. Which says, well, how does that make any sense? Was it good or bad? If it was bad, so Yaakov also should have been destroyed. If it was good, why are you blaming the Jews? And if what they did was bad and he did was good, then it's not the same thing. So the whole medrash doesn't seem to be comprehensible. So he explained the following. There was a common thread in these two stories, right? There was a threat, there was a reaction, and the reaction was kind of the same. They were both afraid. As a matter of fact, it wasn't an accident, because the Jews looked to the example of Yaakov and they understood that no matter what Hashem promises you, you can't be confident, you have to be afraid. But apparently, Yaakov, who was not blamed for his fear, reacted differently from the Jews, who are blamed. Now, what's the difference? Doesn't quite say explicitly in the Medrash, but what we do know is that Yaakov's fear is entirely constructive, right? Because the Torah goes on and on describing all the things that he did, no despair at all. It was simply everything he did was conscious and motivated, and a reaction to that fear in a very specific, and because I'm afraid I have to do this, because I'm afraid I have to do that. Because when he prays to Hashem, he's not wailing in despair. He says, "Look, Hashem, I recognize that I may not be measuring up. Perhaps I've lost favor with you, but please save me. Remember the promises you made, anyways, and that's it. And onward." But with the Jews, as Miguel describes, it was sackcloth mourning. Now, the Rosh said they probably didn't stop keeping Shabbos, and we're not told that they committed any sins, but the attitude, that was enough. The attitude was not apparently. It was, look, at the end of the day, the Jews did do Teshuvah, and they did renew their commitment to the Torah. We know that the whole holiday of Purim is based not just because they were saved, but because of the national renewal that came about as a result. But again, as we know, it's always levels. There was a certain element that crept into that fear that Hashem did not judge to be benign. It was not benign, and the consequences for destructive fear could be actual destruction. So why were they saved? Because they were copying Yaakov. Well, they weren't copying Yaakov. And the answer is, and he called it the line of demarcation. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that, there's two different things. There's Yaakov's fear, which is entirely constructive, and there's the other kind that people like us sometimes have. Because it's like a spectrum of emotions. There isn't a flashing, light with a bright red line and a clear border. It's very easy to drift over the line, especially when you have the Yetzer Hara pulling you strongly. And many examples, not just with other emotions as well, not just with fear, where emotion can start from an entirely good place. It's entirely correct until it isn't, and we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking, well, let's just figure out the right one. You can never go on autopilot or just use our reaction. Well, if I got to be like Yaakov, then my reactions would always be proper. We never react. We act. We act in response. Yaakov acted in response. And if we're not careful, it is easy to get it wrong. And that was Hashem's point. Hashem says, if you're supposed to do A, you did B, what's your excuse? But you're supposed to do, A point this, and you did A point that. And it was almost the same thing, but not quite. It's easy to understand. Parenthetically, the Ramad pointed out that you see part of the point here was they were following the example of Yaakov. In other words, they weren't operating on their own instincts. They were emulating previous generations who had gone before them. So when you're trying to follow in your Rebbe's footsteps, you have a very big pass, a very big leeway to say, look, I was doing what they did. And they should have done a better job, but there's a certain extenuating circumstance. You were trying to follow the example of the sect. How much of a complaint can Hashem have against them? But the point is that, and this is what Rashida said from his own youth when he went to his father and said something, he was afraid or he was demoralized or something, and his father said, "Is this bringing you, to do more mitzvahs, to learn more Torah, or less?" And he said, "I think less." His father said, "Then you know who's talking to you." But it's not as though we can do that test once. We got to do that test again and again. We have to keep our finger on the pulse all the time. And that's really the point. We saw Avram with Chayei Sarah. We mentioned it, and this time around, he was in mourning. So Sarah died. And then the Yetzer Hara whispered to him in his ear, she died because of you, because you did the Akedah, which was kind of true. But it wasn't true in the sense that it didn't make him. It didn't make it wrong. It didn't make him guilty, and it wasn't the reason. And Avram knew that very well. And nevertheless, despite the fact that he knew that very well, and he could have, spoken up in his own defense very well. Instead, what he did was, Vayakam Avram, he got up and stopped mourning and started getting involved in burial arrangements because he said, this is not a battle that I need to have. It's not a battle that is worth having. And he moved on to something else because, it's not something like once you know this, then you'll just do that. It's at every point the Yetzer Hara will always try to shift us into an unhealthy place. And it's not because we necessarily have the wrong attitudes or even the wrong emotions, but even the right emotion when it takes us in the wrong. An emotion is by definition, like the word motion, it moves us to do something. If it's not moving us the right way, then it's moving us the wrong. Then we toss it out, and we shift on to something else. That's the way it is. No emotion is inherently valuable if it's not taking us in the direction we need to go. It's only when it's taking us closer to Hashem. That doesn't mean every emotion is valuable. There is room for guilt. There is room for fear. There is room for all those things. But we always have to ask ourselves, so does that bring me close? And, sometimes the answer is keep the emotion, but channel it in the right direction. And the person does something bad and they feel bad, like, oh, that's going to make me depressed now. Okay, so I won't feel bad. That's not the solution. The solution is I have to try to create a constructive feeling of regret that motivates me to make necessary corrections. And when it starts to become, I say it's hard for me to concentrate on my davening, it's hard for me to interact, then I stop and I shift. Now I got to shift gears. Now I have to interact with people. We have to know, where it's taking us and use it properly. They're all too, like the muktzah thing. Like there are things that are kind of off limits, arrogance, right? It's like a rock. We don't use it for anything. But most emotions are like hammers. They may be used. Some of them are like forks. We use them all the time. Some of them are like hammers. We don't use them except sometimes that we do when there's a constructive purpose. We have to know. They're all part of our toolbox and we have to use them appropriately when we can. If we do that, we're like Yaakov. We're like a person who can play 16 musical instruments and can become virtuoso in every one. That was Yaakov's ability. He knew exactly what he was doing and he did it effectively. That's why he's the perfected person. We all have to follow in his footsteps. What? That's the next. What is the conversation about?